Thank you so much for being here. So today I'm gonna talk a little bit about the case of Puerto Rico. I'm originally from Puerto Rico, and of course I go there all the time, but increasingly I've been studying Puerto Rico from the scholarly perspective, more specifically from the perspective of how is it that countries deal with economic crisis. So to give you a little bit of a background, and probably, if you listen to the news, hopefully you are very familiar with what happened last year in Puerto Rico. In September 20th, 2017, Hurricane Maria, now Puerto Rico is just Maria, right? Hit Puerto Rico. It was a category 5 hurricane, so it was a huge hurricane with lots of devastation. Also, a couple of weeks before that, Puerto Rico was also hit by Irma, which was another hurricane. So that meant that until very recently, people in Puerto Rico still had no power. For the most part, I think now most of the island, if not the majority, has already power. And here, for example, you have a picture from the University of Puerto Rico. That's the tower of the University of Puerto Rico, and you can see the devastation that came with it. So why is it that I would like to talk about Puerto Rico? Well, Puerto Rico is an interesting case for different reasons. First of all, to understand the process of reconstruction in Puerto Rico in regards to the hurricane, we need to understand the situation in Puerto Rico in terms of the context. And in that regard, what we need to take into account, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the debts, but is that in 2015, you had the governor of Puerto Rico who publicly on TV said that the debt is simply unpayable, that the Puerto Rico couldn't pay the debt. And here you can see, for example, that in comparison to many of the jurisdictions in the United States, the Puerto Rican debt is huge, right? It's $73 billion. And I'm gonna give a little bit of context of why is it that Puerto Rico is in this situation right now, because many people, and especially if you listen to President Trump, believe, and there's, for some reason, there's some of that, but believe that simply Puerto Rico has had irresponsible governments who have a lot of corruption, and therefore, long story short, that's why Puerto Rico is in this place. However, to really understand why is it that Puerto Rico is at this stage in history, we need to have a broader understanding of the process of modernization and then post-modernization in the case of Puerto Rico. So first, we have to understand that Puerto Rico became part of the United States in 1898, and in 1917 is when Puerto Ricans officially become citizens of the United States. So there were about a couple of decades in which Puerto Rico was in limbo, but in terms of the economic relationships with the United States, what is really important to understand is that in 1920, the Jones Act, which applies to the whole United States, established the maritime relationships for Puerto Rico with the United States, which is basically about the conditions in which trade take place and also the movement of goods between different countries to Puerto Rico and also from the mainland to Puerto Rico. And more specifically, maybe you are not familiar with this, but you have the Jones Act, which applies to the whole United States. But under the Jones Act, it's the Cabotage, so-called Cabotage Law. What happens is that any trade that takes place within the United States has to take place in a U.S. vessel, right? So any type of transportation or trade needs to be under U.S. jurisdiction. So that means, for example, in the case of the context of the hurricane, which was very important, for example, from Sweden, they were saying, okay, we can send humanitarian aid to Puerto Rico, but that was impossible given the Jones Act, because they simply had to go through the mainland and then go back to Puerto Rico. What happened was that there was a long story short, I think for about 1 or 2 weeks, the Jones Act wasn't applied to the case of Puerto Rico, so some humanitarian aid was able to make it directly to Puerto Rico, but then after that, we're just back to normal in that regard. And again, this applies to all the states in the United States. For example, if in the case of Hawaii, I was looking at data, is super expensive to ship from the United States to Hawaii compared to China. It's almost triple the amount of money. So in that regard, that is important, because if you think about the process of reconstruction, that means that goods, all type of goods in Puerto Rico, especially food, we are not self-sufficient. Given the dynamics of modernization in Puerto Rico, food is extremely expensive in Puerto Rico because everything has to go through the mainland in terms of Jones Act. Now, so we move forward a couple of decades, and here is that we have to understand the process of modernization in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is the perfect case to understand modernization theory. It was kind of the lab from the United States in terms of how do you create democracy and how is it that you push for modernization. For example, the pill, women in Puerto Rico were experimented with the pill and other types of techniques to so-called have growth, democratization, and so forth, right? So if you look at the history of Puerto Rico, basically in 2 or 3 decades, Puerto Rico moves from being having an agricultural type of economy to a modern manufacturer-driven economy. And for example, here you have some data that shows how that took place in terms of thousands. And here you have Luis Muñoz Marin, which was the first Puerto Rican governor in Puerto Rico when the Constitution was written in the 1950s, that he was kind of the hero because he represented democracy, person who stood for growth, for moving forwards in terms of a clear industrialization process, and so forth. So if you look at the history of Puerto Rico was very successful in that regard. But also, on the other side, on the other hand, it also had very negative effects, right? So for example, as I said, and I mentioned, forced sterilization took place in Puerto Rico, in part because of modernization, right? And many other type of projects that basically use Puerto Ricans as guinea pigs to experiment with them. So of course, there are actually legal cases that prove that in that regard. So of course, Puerto Rico moved forward, but there were also these very negative situations, right? Now, once we move forward, I'm of course simplifying here, but throughout this whole process of modernization, there were lots of tax exceptions from the US to Puerto Rico in terms of industries, but the most famous one was what is called Section 936. It was a tax exception to industries that came to Puerto Rico. So for example, many pharmaceuticals went to Puerto Rico. So Lilly was there, Johnson & Johnson, and other types like Converse was in Puerto Rico, many of the big manufacturing industries. And that was from 1976, and finally, there was a process in which slowly, in the Section 93, there was a phase-out process until 2008. But what I'm showing here is very clear that once you have those tax exemptions that are gone, they no longer apply to Puerto Rico, what you have is a whole flight of capital and also different types of actors who leave Puerto Rico. And this is what, in part, why we are in the situation that we are right now. So in that way, to really understand the debt crisis, we have to understand the relationship of the United States with Puerto Rico in terms of tax exemptions. Of course, this goes hand in hand with the whole process of globalization or whatever it is that we want to call it, right? In terms that you have many industries that, especially in the States, that were putting a lot of pressure on Congress so they can go to China and other places. So that in part explains the shrinking economy, the unemployment problem, and so forth. Now, I know that I have to move along, but where is it that we are right now? Well, to start with, this is a project that I'm doing right now, which is as a consequence of the debt crisis, because Puerto Rico cannot file for bankruptcy. The so-called Financial Oversight Management Board for Puerto Rico was created. It's an oversight board, or like they call it in Puerto Rico, la Junta. And if these people here, I think they're the most hated people in Puerto Rico right now, because basically the bottom line is that, as in the case of Detroit, in the case of DC, in the case of New York City, these people here, they have tight links with the banking sector, but also they make all sorts of decisions about not only fiscal decisions, but also policy decisions, and they're not directly elected by the people. So what it has created is a situation in which you have the governor of Puerto Rico saying, well, they're not directly elected, so they shouldn't make decisions, and then you have the court that is involved. There have been many court cases trying to at least clarify the relationship between the Puerto Rican government, the junta, and also the US. So in other words, to underline the bottom line here is that this is a clear case of one, the issue of many people have argued that Puerto Rico is a colony. I will say so, because now it has become very clear that Puerto Rico has no power to make many type of decisions. They have no sovereignty in that regard. And so moving forward, that creates many type of tensions. I can talk a lot about this, but long story short. And from the social scientific, of course, it's very, very tragic. In the end, it was proven through different type of studies that about 3,000 people died in the hurricane. But as a social scientist, what I find very interesting is that you have all these different studies that there was an open discussion on how do you estimate deaths, right? And for example, you have President Trump in one of the tweets who said, well, when I was there, only 8 people died, and suddenly there are 3,000, right? So how do you count the people who die, right? And there were different type of methodologies on how you do that. And I'm gonna stop here because the next person has to come, right? So.